When a factory worker's dying scream shattered the crystal chandeliers of Cork's grandest ballroom, nobody knew the real revolution had already begun on the dance floor. Welcome to a story of forbidden alliances, industrial tyranny, and one woman's refusal to bow before the machine age's cruelest masters. If you want to discover how a dance instructor and a war-scarred lord ignited a rebellion that brought an empire to its knees, stay with us until the very end. Don't forget to hit that like button and comment which city you're watching from. Now, let our story begin. The chandeliers of Ashford Manor blazed like captured stars, their light cascading over silk gowns and military dress uniforms in a waterfall of gold. The ballroom stretched vast and glittering, its marble floors polished to mirror brightness, reflecting the cream of Cork's industrial aristocracy as they swirled through another waltz. Outside, November rain hammered against the tall windows, but inside, warmth and privilege created their own climate, insulated from the wet, cold world where most of humanity struggled. Eliza Harrow stood near the refreshment table, her fingers nervously smoothing the pale green satin of her borrowed gown. She didn't belong here. Not really. The daughter of a dance instructor hardly rated an invitation to the season's most exclusive ball, but Captain Adrian Vale had insisted, and what the younger son of the Vale industrial dynasty wanted, he generally received. "You look like you're preparing for battle rather than a ball," came a warm voice beside her. Eliza turned to find Adrian himself, resplendent in his officer's uniform, his boyish face lit with that easy smile that had first charmed her 6 months ago when he'd wandered into her father's modest dance studio, claiming he needed to improve his technique before the season began. "Perhaps I am," Eliza replied, managing a small smile. "Your world and mine don't often intersect, Adrian. I can feel the stares." "Let them stare." Adrian took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You have more grace and genuine warmth than anyone in this room. Besides, I've been looking forward to our dance all evening." He began to lead her toward the floor, but before they'd taken 3 steps, a commanding voice cut through the music like a blade through silk. "Adrian." The single word carried such authority that couples nearby actually paused mid-step. Eliza felt Adrian's hand tense in hers as they both turned. Lord Marcus Vale stood 10 feet away, and the crowd seemed to part instinctively before him. Where Adrian was warm and approachable, his older brother radiated cold power. Tall and broad-shouldered, Marcus wore evening dress with military precision, though no uniform could contain the aura of someone who'd commanded men in actual battle. His face was striking rather than handsome. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from granite, and eyes the color of winter storm clouds that seemed to assess and dismiss everything they touched. Those eyes now fixed on Eliza with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need to borrow Miss Harrow," Marcus said, not asking, simply stating a fact. Adrian's grip on Eliza's hand tightened protectively. "Marcus, we were just about to dance. Surely whatever business you have can—" "I'm claiming the dance." Marcus stepped forward, and Eliza realized with a shock that he was addressing her directly now, not his brother. "Unless you object, Miss Harrow." It was phrased as a question, but his tone made it clear he expected no refusal. Eliza felt anger flare hot in her chest. She'd spent her entire life watching powerful men assume their wishes were commands, watching her students, the mill workers she taught in the evenings, bow and scrape before the whims of their betters. "Actually, I do object," she heard herself say, her voice clear and steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Captain Vale asked first, and I've accepted. Perhaps you're accustomed to taking whatever you want, Lord Vale, but I'm not something to be commandeered." A ripple of shock moved through the nearby crowd. Adrian made a small sound of alarm, but Marcus's expression shifted. Something that might have been surprise or possibly respect flickered across those cold features. "My apologies," he said, and there was something different in his tone now. "You're quite right. Allow me to rephrase. Miss Harrow, would you do me the honor of this dance? I promise to return you to my brother immediately afterward." Before Eliza could respond, Adrian leaned close and whispered urgently, "Say yes. When Marcus gets like this, it's better not to fight it. I'll claim the next dance, I promise." There was something in Adrian's voice Not quite fear, but a learned wariness that made Eliza wonder what it had been like growing up in the shadow of this formidable older brother. She looked back at Marcus and found him watching her with that unsettling intensity, waiting. "One dance," she agreed finally. "Then you'll leave us in peace." "One dance," Marcus confirmed. His hand closed around hers, and Eliza was struck by the contrast with Adrian's gentle touch. Marcus's grip was firm, controlled, the hand of someone accustomed to wielding both sword and authority. He led her onto the floor with such certainty that the other dancers moved aside automatically, creating space. The orchestra began a new waltz, and Marcus swept her into the pattern with practiced ease. He was an excellent dancer, better than Adrian, Eliza realized with surprise, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute body control. For a man who radiated such barely contained power, he was remarkably light on his feet. They danced in silence for nearly a full minute, Marcus guiding her through the intricate steps with mechanical precision. But Eliza could feel his attention on her, assessing, calculating. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke. "If you have something to say, Lord Vale, I'd prefer you simply say it rather than examining me like a specimen under glass." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Direct. I appreciate that." "Very well, Miss Harrow. I wanted to speak with you about your evening activities." Eliza's stomach tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Marcus executed a smooth turn, bringing them dangerously close to the edge of the dance floor near the tall windows. "Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, you teach dance to workers from the textile mills. In a converted warehouse near the docks. You charge nothing, though you can hardly afford such charity on a dance instructor's daughter's income." Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks, part anger, part fear. "You've been spying on me?" "I make it my business to know what happens in this city, Miss Harrow, particularly when it involves my family's mills." "The Vale mills employ half of Cork," Eliza shot back. "Everyone in this city is connected to your mills in some way. That doesn't give you the right to—" "I'm not criticizing," Marcus interrupted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm simply stating facts. You take exhausted workers who've spent 14 hours at their looms and you teach them to waltz, to move with grace and dignity. You give them something they have no practical use for." "Is there a point to this interrogation?" Eliza demanded, meeting his storm cloud eyes with defiance. "Yes." Marcus pulled her slightly closer as they navigated a crowded section of the floor. "I want to know why." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Why waste your time and limited resources on something so fundamentally useless? These people need food, better wages, safer working conditions. What good does teaching them to dance do?" The casual dismissal in his tone ignited something fierce in Eliza's chest. She'd faced this question before, from her father's business associates, from well-meaning friends, even from some of the workers themselves initially. But hearing it from this arrogant lord, who'd never spent a day struggling to make ends meet, who'd never known what it was to be considered less than human because of your station in life, it was too much. "You want to know why?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Because those workers spend 14 hours a day being treated like machine parts. Because the foremen shout at them like they're animals. Because society tells them they're worth nothing beyond their labor. And for 2 hours a week in that converted warehouse, they get to be something more. They get to feel elegant, dignified, human." Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but she thought she saw something shift behind his eyes. "For 2 hours a week," Eliza continued, passion making her reckless, "Mary Sullivan isn't just a woman with ruined hands and a chronic cough from cotton dust. She's a dancer. Thomas Brennan isn't just a man who lost 2 fingers to a loom malfunction. He's learning the proper way to lead a lady. They remember that they're people, Lord Vale. People who deserve beauty and grace and moments of joy, no matter how impractical you might find that." "And you think that's enough?" Marcus asked quietly. "You think teaching them to waltz will change their circumstances?" "I think," Eliza said fiercely, "that remembering your own humanity is the first step toward demanding others treat you humanely. I think dignity and hope aren't useless luxuries. They're necessities. And I think anyone who's forgotten that has lost something essential about what it means to be human." They'd reached the far corner of the ballroom now, near the windows where the crowd thinned. Marcus slowed their movements, his grip on her hand tightening fractionally. "Hope," he said, and there was something bitter in his tone. "You want to give them hope?" "Yes." "Hope is dangerous, Miss Harrow." His voice dropped lower, intimate and hard. "Hope makes people dissatisfied with their lot. It makes them question the order of things. And when you start questioning the order, everything becomes unstable. This city runs on industry, and industry requires a certain hierarchy, a certain acceptance of one's place." Eliza stared at him, shock and fury warring in her chest. "You're saying people should simply accept exploitation, accept suffering, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps the powerful choose to throw them?" "I'm saying that the world is built on hard realities, not pretty dreams," Marcus replied. "I've seen what happens when order breaks down, in war, in revolution, in the chaos that follows when people stop accepting the structures that hold civilization together. And it's never the powerful who suffer most. It's always the weak, the vulnerable, the very people you claim to want to help." "So your solution is to keep them weak? Keep them accepting?" Eliza pulled slightly back, though his hand still held hers in the dance. "That's not wisdom, Lord Vale. That's cowardice dressed up as pragmatism." For a moment, something flashed in Marcus's eyes, anger perhaps, or maybe something more complex. His jaw tightened, and Eliza braced herself for a cutting response. But before he could speak, the ballroom doors burst open with a crash that made half the dancers stumble to a halt. A man stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, his working-class clothes marking him as catastrophically out of place in this glittering assembly. He was young, barely into his 20s, but grief had aged his face a decade. Blood stained his hands and shirt sleeves. "Murderers!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "You're all murderers!" The orchestra stuttered to a discordant halt. Women gasped. Several men moved instinctively toward the intruder, but something in his anguished rage made them hesitate. "She's dead!" The man's voice cracked with sobs. "My Bridget, she's dead, and it's your fault. The Vale Mills killed her." Eliza felt Marcus go absolutely still beside her, his whole body tensing like a drawn blade. But he didn't release her hand. "She worked 15 hours a day in your hell factories," the man continued, tears streaming down his face. "Breathing cotton dust until she couldn't breathe at all, coughing up blood every morning. And when she finally collapsed at her station, when she was dying on that filthy factory floor, you know what your foreman did?" The ballroom had gone deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on the grieving man. "He stepped over her body," the man whispered, the words somehow more terrible for being quiet. "He told the other workers to get back to their stations, said she was probably just faking for attention. And she died there, on that floor, surrounded by machines that never stopped running. Because your profits are worth more than her life, more than any of our lives." "Security!" someone shouted, and uniformed men finally began moving toward the intruder. But the man wasn't finished. His eyes swept the crowd, landing on the knot of well-dressed industrialists near the center of the room. "You build your mansions on our graves," he said. "You dance on our bones. But God sees, God knows. And one day soon, we won't bow anymore. We won't accept. We won't—" The security men grabbed him then, dragging him backward through the doors despite his struggles. His voice echoed down the hallway, still shouting accusations, until finally the heavy doors slammed shut and silence crashed back over the ballroom like a wave. For a long moment, nobody moved. The glittering crowd seemed frozen, uncertain how to process what had just happened. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, conversation began again, nervous at first, then growing louder, determined to drown out the memory of that grieving man's words. "How dreadful," someone nearby murmured. "Drunk, no doubt," another voice agreed. "These workers, they spend their wages on gin and then blame everyone else for their troubles. Still, it's unsettling. Perhaps the mills should increase security." Eliza felt sick. Around her, the aristocracy was already dismissing what they'd heard, already rebuilding the comfortable walls that separated their world from the suffering that funded it. She looked up at Marcus, expecting to see the same cold indifference she heard in the voices around them. Instead, she saw something she couldn't quite read. His face had gone carefully blank, but his hand trembled slightly where it still held hers. His eyes were fixed on the doors through which the man had been dragged, and something worked in his jaw like he was biting back words. "Lord Vale?" Eliza said quietly. Marcus blinked, seeming to remember where he was. He looked down at her, and for just a moment she saw past the armor of authority and power to something raw underneath, pain, or perhaps guilt. "I believe," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that our dance is finished, Miss Harrow." He released her hand, stepped back, and gave her a precise bow. Then, before she could respond, he turned and walked away, cutting through the crowd with such purpose that people scrambled to get out of his path. Eliza stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, her heart hammering, her mind racing. Adrian appeared at her elbow moments later, his face tight with concern. "Eliza, I'm so sorry. My brother, he shouldn't have—" "Your brother just had his comfortable worldview challenged," Eliza interrupted, watching Marcus's broad shoulders disappear into the crowd. "As did everyone else in this room. The question is whether anyone will actually hear it." "That man was clearly disturbed," Adrian said gently. "What happened to his wife is tragic, of course, but accidents happen in factories. It's the nature of industrial work." Eliza turned to look at Adrian, sweet, kind Adrian, who'd never intended harm to anyone in his life, and she realized with sinking certainty that he genuinely believed what he was saying, that he could stand in this palace built on the backs of suffering workers and truly think their deaths were simply inevitable accidents. "Take me home," she said quietly. "Please, Adrian. I want to go home." Concern flooded his features. "Of course. Let me get your coat." As Adrian hurried away, Eliza looked out over the glittering ballroom one more time. The orchestra had resumed playing. Couples had returned to dancing. The machinery of aristocratic privilege had smoothly absorbed the interruption and continued its gilded rotation. But something had shifted. Eliza could feel it, a crack in the foundation, small but growing. That grieving man's words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to completely dispel no matter how hard they all pretended. And somewhere in this vast manor, Marcus Vale was thinking about what he'd heard. She was certain of it. She'd seen something break through that cold facade during their dance, had felt him respond to her passionate defense of her students with something more than dismissal. What that might mean, she couldn't guess. But as Adrian returned with her coat and led her through the crowd toward the exit, Eliza found herself thinking not about the gentle officer beside her, but about his harder, colder brother. About storm cloud eyes and a grip like iron. About a man who understood that hope was dangerous. The rain had intensified by the time Adrian's carriage delivered Eliza to the modest house she shared with her father on Merchant Street. She thanked him for the evening, deflected his concerns about her subdued mood, and promised to see him soon. As the carriage rattled away into the night, she stood in the rain for a moment, letting the cold water wash away the stifling warmth of Ashford Manor. The house was dark. Her father would be asleep already, exhausted from a full day of giving private dance lessons to merchant-class families trying to polish their daughters for the marriage market. Eliza let herself in quietly, removed her borrowed gown with care, and changed into her nightdress. But sleep proved elusive. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over. The ball. The dance with Marcus, the grieving worker and his terrible accusations, Adrian's easy dismissal of it all. Bridget. The dead woman's name was Bridget. How many other Bridgets were there? How many Mary Sullivans coughing up cotton dust in their beds right now? How many Thomas Brennans missing fingers or worse? Eliza knew the answer because she saw them twice a week. She saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the premature aging of their faces, the way they moved like every bone hurt. She knew about the industrial accidents that maimed and killed with grim regularity. She knew about the wages that barely covered rent and food, leaving nothing for medicine or respite. And she knew that her dance classes, as much as she believed in their value, were a bandage on a gaping wound. They gave her students moments of dignity and joy, yes, but moments weren't enough when the other 166 hours of their weeks were filled with grinding suffering. Marcus Vale's words came back to her. What good does teaching them to dance do? He'd meant it as criticism, as dismissal of her efforts. But lying there in the dark, Eliza heard the question differently. What good was she actually doing? Was she helping these people? Or was she making their oppression easier to bear? Was she giving them strength to demand change? Or was she giving them just enough comfort that they wouldn't demand it? The thought made her feel sick. She must have eventually fallen asleep because she woke to bright morning sunlight and her father knocking on her door. "Eliza, are you awake? There's someone here to see you." She struggled upright, confused and still half asleep. "What time is it?" "Nearly 9. Come down when you're dressed." 9? She never slept so late. Eliza hurried through her morning routine, pinning her dark hair into a simple bun and throwing on a modest day dress. When she came downstairs, she found her father in the front parlor, looking distinctly uncomfortable across from an unexpected visitor. Lord Marcus Vale stood by the window, looking entirely too large and out of place in their small, shabby parlor. He'd traded his evening dress for more practical attire, well-tailored but understated, though he still carried that unmistakable air of command that marked him as fundamentally separate from ordinary people. He turned when Eliza entered, and those storm cloud eyes fixed on her with that same unsettling intensity from the previous night. "Miss Harrow," he said, inclining his head. "Thank you for seeing me." "Lord Vale." Eliza glanced at her father, who looked thoroughly bewildered. "This is unexpected." "I'll leave you two to talk," her father said, edging toward the door with obvious relief. "Eliza, I'll be in the studio if you need me." Once they were alone, an awkward silence descended. Marcus didn't sit, didn't even seem to consider it. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture military straight, studying her. "You were right," he said abruptly, "last night about what you said." Eliza blinked, completely thrown. I beg your pardon?" "About dignity. About treating people as human rather than machine parts." Marcus's jaw tightened. "After you left, I couldn't stop thinking about that man, about what he said, about Bridget." He spoke the dead woman's name with unexpected gentleness. "I'm glad," Eliza said carefully, unsure where this was going. "Though I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Marcus was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. When he spoke again, his voice was low and intense. "I don't legally own the mills anymore. Haven't for 3 years. I transferred ownership to a consortium of investors when I returned from the war, men who promised modernization and efficiency while I focused on other ventures. But those mills still bear the Vale name. Workers still call them the Vale Mills. And if what that man said last night is true, if conditions have deteriorated to the point where women are dying and being ignored..." He trailed off, something like anger tightening his features. "I need to know the truth," he finished. "Not the sanitized reports the investors feed me, not the numbers on ledgers. The actual truth about what's happening in those factories." "Then visit them," Eliza said. "You're Lord Vale. Walk through the mills yourself. See the conditions with your own eyes." "I have." Marcus's expression turned bitter. "Twice in the past year. Both times I was given carefully orchestrated tours, clean floors, smiling workers, management hovering to ensure no one spoke out of turn. I saw exactly what the investors wanted me to see, and I was foolish enough to believe it." He moved closer, and Eliza found herself taking an instinctive step back, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer force of his presence. "But you," Marcus continued, "you teach the workers. They trust you. They talk to you. You see the truth they hide from men like me." Understanding dawned cold and heavy in Eliza's stomach. "You want me to spy for you?" "I want you to help me see what's really happening," Marcus corrected. "I want access to the truth so I can actually fix what's broken, instead of trusting the reassurances of men who profit from suffering." Eliza crossed her arms, studying him with suspicion. "Why should I believe you actually care? Last night you were lecturing me about the dangers of hope and the necessity of people accepting their place." "Last night, I was defending a system I'd convinced myself was necessary," Marcus said bluntly. "This morning I woke up thinking about a woman named Bridget who died on a factory floor while a foreman stepped over her body. I don't know if I can fix what's broken, Miss Harrow. I don't even know the full extent of what's broken, but I'd like to try, and I need your help to do it." Eliza wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her not to trust this powerful man who'd spent the previous evening defending exploitation as necessary for social order. But she thought about Mary Sullivan and Thomas Brennan and all her other students, thought about how many more Bridgets might be dying while the powerful looked away. If Marcus Vale genuinely wanted to investigate, if there was even a chance he might actually help, rather than simply make himself feel better while changing nothing, could she afford to refuse? "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked finally. Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral, but she thought she detected relief in his eyes. "Come with me into the industrial districts," he said. "Introduce me to workers who'll speak honestly. Help me document what's really happening, and in exchange, I'll use every resource at my disposal to address what we find. And if what we find implicates your investors, your brother, your family name, then we address it anyway," Marcus said, and there was steel in his voice. "I spent 5 years in the army, Miss Harrow. I've seen what happens when commanders prioritize their own comfort over the welfare of their men. I won't make that mistake again." Eliza studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. But all she saw was grim determination and something that might have been shame. "Very well," she said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, you follow my lead when we're in the workers' districts. You don't announce yourself as Lord Vale. You don't pull rank or throw your weight around. You listen more than you speak." Marcus nodded. "Agreed." "Second, anything we discover, any evidence we gather, you don't suppress it or bury it to protect your family's reputation. Whatever the truth is, we expose it." "Agreed." "And third," Eliza said, stepping forward until she was close enough to see the faint scar along his jawline, "if I discover you're doing this to manipulate public opinion or protect the investors while appearing concerned, if I find out you're using me, I will make sure every worker in Cork knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Something that might have been admiration flickered across Marcus's face. "Noted. Though I'd expect nothing less from a woman who told a lord to his face that he was a coward disguised as a pragmatist." "I stand by that assessment," Eliza said coolly. "Good." Marcus extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement?" Eliza looked at his offered hand, large, scarred, belonging to a man who represented everything she'd spent her life fighting against. A man of power and privilege who'd likely forget about suffering the moment it became inconvenient, but also possibly a man who'd genuinely been shaken by what he'd witnessed, who might actually have the resources and influence to create real change if properly motivated. She took his hand. "We have an agreement." His grip was firm and warm, and as their hands clasped, Eliza felt the same electric current she'd experienced during their dance, a sense that something significant had just shifted, though whether for good or ill she couldn't yet say. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tomorrow evening," Marcus said, "after your dance class. I'll meet you at the warehouse." He released her hand and moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Miss Harrow? Thank you for giving me a chance to do something right." Then he was gone, leaving Eliza standing alone in the shabby parlor, wondering what she'd just agreed to and whether she'd made the right choice or the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Outside, the rain had started again, drumming against the windows like fingers tapping out a warning. The converted warehouse on Dock Street smelled of sweat, lamp oil, and desperation masked by determination. Eliza arrived early that Thursday evening, as she always did, to sweep the floor and arrange the borrowed chairs along the walls. The space was nothing like the glittering ballroom at Ashford Manor, bare wooden floors, exposed beams, walls that didn't quite keep out the November chill, but it was theirs, paid for by pooling pennies from workers who could barely afford bread. She'd just finished lighting the lamps when the first students began trickling in. Mary Sullivan came through the door looking more exhausted than usual, her face gray beneath the freckles, her breathing labored. She was only 32 but looked 50, worn down by 12 years at the looms. "Mary," Eliza said gently, taking the woman's rough, calloused hands. "How are you feeling?" "Grand, just grand," Mary lied, the Irish lilt in her voice not quite hiding the wheeze beneath her words. "Wouldn't miss our evening for anything, would I?" Thomas Brennan arrived next, his left hand wrapped in fresh bandages. He'd lost 2 fingers to a loom malfunction 6 months ago, but he still came faithfully to practice the waltz, learning to lead despite his injury. Behind him came Margaret O'Connell, Peter Walsh, Catherine Doyle. 15 workers in total, the ones brave enough or desperate enough to spend their few free hours remembering they were human. Eliza was leading them through the basic box step when the warehouse door opened again and Marcus Vale stepped inside. The transformation in the room was immediate and terrible. The music, Peter's wife playing a battered fiddle, stuttered to a halt. Every worker froze mid-step, fear flooding their faces. Thomas actually moved in front of Mary, as if his diminished frame could protect her from the powerful lord who'd just invaded their sanctuary. "It's all right," Eliza said quickly, moving between Marcus and her students. "He's with me." "With you?" Mary's voice climbed toward panic. "Miss Eliza, that's Lord Vale. I know who he is," Eliza interrupted firmly, "and I've asked him to observe tonight, to learn." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief and betrayal. Eliza could see it in their faces, the feeling that she'd broken something sacred, that she'd let the enemy into their one safe space. Marcus stood very still just inside the door, and Eliza was grateful he had the sense not to speak. He wore plain worker's clothes, coarse wool trousers, a simple shirt, a cap that half hid his aristocratic features. Anyone who didn't know him might have mistaken him for a foreman or skilled tradesman, but there was no hiding the way he carried himself. That aura of command that marked him as fundamentally different from the people shrinking away from him. "I need you to trust me," Eliza said to her students. "I wouldn't have brought him here if I didn't believe he genuinely wants to understand, to help." "Help?" Catherine Doyle's voice was sharp with bitterness. "Like his family's helped by working us 14 hours a day? Like they helped Bridget Murphy into an early grave?" The name hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus flinched. Eliza saw it, a tiny but genuine reaction. "I knew Bridget," he said quietly, and every eye snapped to him. "Not well, but I knew her. She worked Section C, third floor of the main mill. She had a beautiful singing voice. I heard her once, years ago, before I went to war, and what happened to her was unconscionable." The workers stared at him, clearly not expecting a lord to know such details, much less admit fault. "I can't change the past," Marcus continued, taking a careful step forward. "I can't bring Bridget back or undo years of suffering, but I can try to make sure it doesn't continue. That's why I'm here, to learn the truth, to see what I've been blind to, and then to fix it." "Pretty words," Thomas muttered. "We've heard pretty words before. They don't put food on the table or stop the machines from taking fingers." "You're right," Marcus agreed, surprising them again. "Words are cheap. So let me prove myself through actions. Miss Harrow has agreed to help me investigate conditions at the mills, to document what's really happening. I need your help to do that. Your testimony, your truth." Mary stepped forward, her breathing ragged. "And what happens when we tell you the truth? When we talk against your investors and your brother, you think they won't find out? You think we won't pay for it?" The fear in her voice was raw and real, and Eliza felt a spike of anger at Marcus for putting these people in this position. But before she could intervene, Marcus pulled something from his pocket, a small notebook and a pencil. "Nothing you tell me will be attributed to you by name unless you explicitly agree to it," he said. "I'll document everything, but I'll protect your identities. You have my word." "The word of a lord," Catherine said flatly. "Forgive us if we don't find that particularly reassuring." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Then let me earn your trust. Ask me anything. Tell me your conditions. I'll meet them." The warehouse fell silent except for the creak of old timber and the distant sound of ships' bells from the harbor. Eliza watched her students exchange glances, silently communicating in that way people who'd worked side by side for years could manage. Finally, Mary spoke. "You want the truth? Come to the mills tomorrow. Not for a fancy tour. Come at dawn when we start our shifts. Come at noon when we get our 15-minute break. Come at nightfall when we finally stumble out. See what 14 hours in hell actually looks like." "I'll be there," Marcus said immediately. "And you?" Mary turned to Eliza, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or an anger, or both. "You swear he's genuine? You swear this isn't some trick to identify troublemakers?" Eliza thought about lying, about offering easy reassurance. But these people deserved honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to believe he's genuine. I think he might be. But I can't swear to his intentions because I don't know what's in his heart. What I can swear is that I'll be watching him. And if he betrays us, I'll make him regret it. The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched, but he didn't contradict her. Mary studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. All right then. We'll give you a chance, Lord Vale. But the moment you prove us wrong, the moment you show yourself to be like all the other rich bastards who've ground us under their heels, we'll know. And Miss Eliza won't need to make you regret it, because we will. There was steel beneath Mary's exhaustion, and Eliza felt a surge of fierce pride in her student. Understood, Marcus said. Thank you. The tension didn't completely dissipate, but it loosened enough that Eliza could breathe again. She clapped her hands together, forcing brightness into her voice. Well then, shall we continue? We were working on the natural turn. Mary, would you partner with Thomas? Catherine with Peter? Slowly, reluctantly, the workers returned to their positions. Peter's wife lifted her fiddle again, and the simple waltz melody filled the warehouse. But the joy that usually accompanied their lessons was absent tonight, replaced by wary watchfulness. Marcus remained near the door, his notebook in hand, observing without interfering. Eliza caught him watching Mary particularly closely as the woman struggled through the steps, her breathing increasingly labored. By the end of the hour, Mary was leaning heavily on Thomas, her face pale and damp with sweat. That's enough for tonight, Eliza announced, though they usually practiced longer. Same time next week? The workers nodded, gathering their few belongings. As they filed out, each one passed close to Marcus, studying him with varying degrees of suspicion and hope. He met each gaze steadily, nodding respectfully. When they were alone, except for Mary, who'd sunk into a chair catching her breath, Marcus approached Eliza. Is she all right? He asked quietly, nodding toward Mary. No, Eliza said bluntly. She's dying, cotton dust in her lungs. It's called white lung disease, and it's common among workers who've spent years in the textile mills. There's no cure, and it only gets worse. Marcus's jaw tightened. He crossed to where Mary sat, crouching down so he was at her eye level. How long have you been sick? He asked. Mary looked at him with surprise, then resignation. 2 years? Maybe 3? Hard to say when the coughing started bad enough to notice. And the mill doctors? What have they said? A bitter laugh escaped Mary's lips. Mill doctors? There's no such thing, Lord Vale. When you're sick, you either work through it or you don't get paid. And if you don't get paid, you don't eat, so you work. What about Bridget Murphy? Marcus pressed gently. You knew her? Mary's expression crumpled. It was my friend, my best friend. We worked side by side for 8 years. Watched her get sicker and sicker, same as me. But she had 3 children to feed, so she kept working even when she could barely stand. And then one day, her voice broke. Marcus reached out as if to comfort her, then seemed to think better of it, his hand falling back to his side. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded genuine. I'm truly sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back, Mary said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. Sorry doesn't feed her children, who are in the orphanage now because their father couldn't afford to keep them. Sorry is just a word, Lord Vale. I know. Marcus stood, his face hard. Which is why I need to do more than apologize. Tomorrow morning dawn, which mill do you work at? Victoria Mill, Section C, like Bridget. I'll be there. After Mary left, Eliza locked up the warehouse and found Marcus waiting outside in the rain. He stood without an umbrella or coat, seemingly oblivious to the water soaking through his borrowed worker's clothes. You should go home, Eliza said. Get dry. Walk with me first, Marcus replied. Please, there's something I need to see. Against her better judgment, Eliza agreed. They walked through the industrial district as night fell completely, the gas lamps casting sickly yellow pools of light on wet cobblestones. Around them, the workers' tenements rose like diseased growths, narrow buildings packed with too many people, laundry hanging from every window like surrender flags, the smell of too many bodies and not enough sanitation thick in the air. Marcus said nothing, but Eliza watched him take in every detail. The children playing in filthy gutters because there was nowhere else to play. The women hunched over washing tubs despite the late hour because mill work didn't leave time during daylight. The men stumbling home from pubs, seeking oblivion in cheap gin because their bodies hurt too much for sleep to come naturally. They passed a group of children, none older than 10, sitting on a stoop sharing a single loaf of bread among 7 of them. Marcus stopped. "Shouldn't they be in school?" he asked quietly. "There is no school," Eliza replied. "Not for them. They'll start in the mills next year. The investors prefer young workers. Small hands fit into tight spaces in the machines. And they can pay children half what they'd pay adults." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "That's illegal. The Factory Act prohibits employment of children under 9 years old." "Yes, and the mills report full compliance. But I've seen children as young as 6 working the night shifts. The inspectors always come during the day when the youngest children are hidden. And who's going to report it? The parents who need those wages to survive?" They continued walking, turning down a narrow alley that opened onto the canal. Here, the smell was even worse. Industrial runoff mixing with sewage, creating a toxic soup that glowed faintly in the lamplight. A dead dog floated past, bloated and forgotten. "This is where many of your workers live," Eliza said. "In buildings that should have been condemned years ago. Paying rent that takes most of their wages to landlords who do nothing to maintain the properties. And if they complain, they're evicted, because there are always more desperate people willing to take their place." Marcus stared at the filthy canal, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Eliza, I didn't know it was this bad." "Didn't know or didn't want to know?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended, but she didn't apologize. Marcus turned to face her, and in the dim lamplight, his face looked older, harder. "Both. I let myself believe the sanitized reports because believing otherwise would have required action, would have required confronting men I considered allies, would have required admitting that my family's fortune, that my entire life, has been built on this." He gestured at the squalid scene around them. "I told myself the system worked," he continued. "That industry provided jobs, that jobs provided livelihood, that everyone benefited. But this isn't livelihood. This is survival at its most brutal. And I've been complicit in it." "So what are you going to do?" Eliza challenged. "Because recognizing a problem is easy, Lord Vale. Actually fixing it when it requires you to sacrifice something, that's hard." Marcus met her gaze, and something fierce burned in those storm cloud eyes. "Tomorrow I start documenting everything, and then I start burning it all down if that's what it takes to rebuild it properly." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. This wasn't the cold, pragmatic lord from the ball. This was something rawer, more dangerous. "Come on," she said. "You need to get dry, and I need to get home before my father worries." They walked back through the industrial district in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Merchant Street, Marcus paused at the corner. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for showing me the truth." "Don't thank me yet," Eliza replied. "Thank me when you've actually done something about it." She left him standing in the rain and hurried home, her mind churning. Part of her wanted to believe Marcus was genuine, that he would actually follow through on his promises. But she'd seen too many well-intentioned aristocrats make grand proclamations and then retreat to their comfortable lives when real change proved difficult. She would watch, she would hope, but she wouldn't trust. Not yet. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky the color of old iron. Eliza met Marcus outside Victoria Mill as workers streamed toward the massive brick building like ants converging on a carcass. He wore the same borrowed workers' clothes, his cap pulled low, trying to blend in. "Stay close to me," Eliza instructed, "and don't speak unless spoken to. Just observe." They joined the crowd pushing through the mill's entrance. The foreman at the gate, a thick-necked brute named Connors, counted heads as workers passed, making marks in his ledger. His eyes lingered on Eliza with unpleasant recognition. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice dripping false courtesy. "Slumming with the workers again? Or have you finally decided to earn an honest living?" "I'm observing," Eliza replied coolly. "Researching conditions for a report." Connor's expression hardened. "Report? For who?" "For interested parties who want to understand how modern industry operates," Marcus interjected smoothly, his accent carefully roughened to sound less aristocratic. "We're just looking, not interfering." Connor studied Marcus with suspicion, but apparently decided they weren't worth the trouble. "Stay out of the way. Production's behind quota, and I don't need complications." Inside, the mill was hell-rendered in brick and iron. The noise hit first, a deafening roar of hundreds of looms operating simultaneously, so loud that normal conversation was impossible. Then came the heat, despite the November cold outside. The machines generated tremendous warmth, and combined with the press of bodies and the lack of ventilation, the temperature climbed toward unbearable. But worst was the air. Cotton dust hung thick as fog, visible in the shafts of weak daylight filtering through grimy windows. Every breath tasted of fiber and industrial chemicals. Within minutes, Eliza felt her throat growing raw. Mary Sullivan stood at her station on the third floor, Section C, her hands moving with practiced precision as she managed 3 looms simultaneously. Her face was already gray with exhaustion and dust, though the shift had barely started. She nodded minutely at Eliza but didn't pause in her work. Around her, dozens of other workers maintained the same frantic pace. Most were women, their hair tied back in scarves, their fingers flying faster than seemed humanly possible. Children, despite what the law said, despite what the official reports claimed, crawled beneath the running looms, replacing bobbins and clearing jams while the machinery thundered inches above their heads. Marcus stood frozen, his face pale beneath the cap, watching a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old squeeze into a space between 2 looms to retrieve a dropped tool. The machines didn't slow, didn't stop. If her dress caught, if she slipped, she would be pulled into the grinding gears. The girl emerged safely and scurried to the next loom without a word, without acknowledgement that she'd just risked her life for a dropped wrench. Eliza touched Marcus's arm and nodded toward the far end of the floor. They moved along the wall, trying to stay unobtrusive. Every few yards, Marcus would pause to write in his small notebook, documenting what he saw. The workers noticed but said nothing, their eyes tracking him with wary hope. At the end of the row, they found a woman collapsed against the wall, coughing so violently that blood speckled her lips. No one stopped working, no one helped her. A foreman walked past, glanced at her with annoyance, and kept moving. "Help her," Marcus said urgently, grabbing Eliza's arm. "If we do, she'll be marked as weak," Eliza replied, her heart breaking. "They'll dock her pay. Maybe fire her. We can't just leave her. We have to. This is what I needed you to see. This is the truth." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, to do something, but finally he nodded and stepped back. The woman continued coughing, alone in a room full of people, until eventually she forced herself upright and returned to her station, wiping blood from her mouth with a trembling hand. They stayed for 3 hours, documenting everything. The absence of safety guards on the machines, the children working illegally, the workers eating their meager lunch hunched over the looms because there was no break room, no time to actually stop, the foreman who shouted and shoved and threatened anyone who slowed production, and always, always the dust. Thick enough to see, to taste, to feel, coating the inside of lungs with every breath. Finally, as the shift change approached, they slipped out through a side entrance. The fresh air outside felt like a gift, though Eliza's throat was raw and her chest hurt from the hours of breathing cotton fiber. Marcus leaned against the brick wall, his face ashen, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his notebook. "That girl," he said hoarsely. "The one under the looms. She can't be more than 7 years old." "Probably younger," Eliza confirmed. "Small for her age because of malnutrition. And the woman coughing blood will be dead within the year, maybe sooner, just like Bridget." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was hard as iron. "Who owns this mill, specifically, not the consortium? Individual names?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "The ownership structure is deliberately obscure, but someone knows. Someone is profiting from this." "Then we find out who." Marcus straightened, his shock hardening into something more dangerous. Determination. "We find out who owns these mills, who makes the decisions, who's stealing wages and allowing these conditions, and then we destroy them." Before Eliza could respond, footsteps echoed from the alley behind them. They turned to find Connors blocking their exit, flanked by 2 other foremen. "Thought you said you were just observing," Connors said, his voice menacing. "But I saw you writing things down, taking notes. That seems like more than observing to me." "We have every right to—" Eliza began, but Connors cut her off. You have no rights here, Miss Harrow. This is private property. And you, he jabbed a thick finger at Marcus. I don't know who you are, but you're not a worker, I can tell. So why don't you hand over that notebook and we'll forget this little incident? Marcus tucked the notebook inside his coat. I don't think so. Connor's face darkened. I wasn't asking. He stepped forward and the two foremen moved to flank him. These were big men, accustomed to using violence to enforce compliance. Eliza felt a spike of fear, but Marcus didn't retreat. Instead, he straightened to his full height, and suddenly that aristocratic bearing he'd been trying to hide blazed forth like a signal fire. I am Lord Marcus Vale, he said, his voice cutting through the alley like a blade. And you will step aside. The transformation in Connors was immediate and almost comical. All the menace drained away, replaced by confusion and growing fear. Lord Vale? But I thought, the manager said you weren't, I didn't know. Clearly, Marcus said coldly. Now step aside before I add attempted assault to the list of infractions I'm documenting. Connors practically scrambled backward, the other foremen following suit. They fled back into the mill, leaving Marcus and Eliza alone in the alley. So much for maintaining a low profile, Eliza said dryly. Marcus grimaced. I know, I'm sorry. But I wasn't letting them take this notebook, and I wasn't letting them hurt you. Very chivalrous, Eliza replied, though she was secretly touched by his protectiveness. But now they know we're investigating. Word will spread. The managers will have time to hide evidence, intimidate workers into silence. Then we move faster, Marcus said. Today we've documented Victoria Mill. Tomorrow we visit the other 3 mills in the consortium. By the end of the week, we'll have enough evidence to confront the investors directly. And then what? Eliza challenged. You really think they'll just agree to reform because you ask nicely? No, Marcus said, his expression grim. I think they'll fight. I think they'll use every resource at their disposal to protect their profits, which is why we need allies. Workers willing to testify, journalists willing to publish the truth, politicians willing to force change. That's ambitious. It's necessary. Marcus looked back at the mill, his jaw tight. After what I saw in there, I can't unsee it. I can't go back to pretending it's acceptable. Even if it costs me everything. Eliza studied him, searching for any hint that this was performance, that his outrage would fade when confronted with real consequences. But all she saw was genuine determination, and for the first time since this unlikely partnership began, she felt the stirrings of actual hope. All right, she said, then let's keep going, but we do this smart. We document everything, protect the workers who help us, and build a case so strong that even the investors can't dismiss it. Marcus extended his hand. Partners? Eliza took it. Partners. But I'm still watching you, Lord Vale. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I'd expect nothing less, Miss Harrow. They walked back toward the city center as workers poured out for the shift change, exhausted bodies dragging toward tenements and taverns. Mary Sullivan emerged with the crowd, her breathing labored, her face the color of old parchment. She saw them and managed a small nod before disappearing into the mass of humanity. We're going to save them, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to Eliza. All of them. Or die trying. Eliza didn't respond, because she knew, even if Marcus didn't yet realize it, that people like them, people who challenged the established order, often did die trying. The powerful didn't surrender their privileges easily, and workers who demanded dignity were typically crushed beneath the same machines they operated. But as they walked through the industrial district while twilight fell, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years of teaching dance to dying workers, of watching good people ground down by an indifferent system. She felt like maybe, just maybe, real change was possible, and that made her more afraid than she'd ever been in her life. That fear proved prophetic faster than Eliza could have imagined. 2 days after their Victoria Mill investigation, she arrived at the warehouse for Thursday evening's dance class to find the door hanging open, one hinge torn completely free. Her heart lurched as she pushed inside and saw the devastation. Chairs smashed to kindling, the borrowed fiddle crushed beneath a boot heel, its strings curled like dying fingers, and painted across the far wall in dripping red letters. Traitors die. Eliza stood frozen, staring at the wreckage of the one safe space her students had possessed. Her hands trembled as she picked up a splintered chair leg, feeling the rage and violation radiate from the destroyed room like heat from a furnace. "Eliza!" She spun to find Marcus in the doorway, his face going pale as he took in the scene. He moved quickly to her side, his hand closing gently on her shoulder. "Are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm fine. I just got here." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "But they knew, Marcus. Someone knew what we're doing, and they did this." Marcus's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. "Connors. He must have reported back to the managers after we left Victoria Mill. This is a warning." "A warning?" Eliza's voice climbed toward hysteria. "This is a threat. Against me. Against the workers. Against anyone who dares to challenge them." She hurled the chair leg across the room where it clattered against the wall beneath that terrible message. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was surrender, and she would not surrender. "We need to contact the police," Marcus said, pulling out his notebook. "Document this. File a formal complaint." "The police?" Eliza laughed bitterly. "Half of them are on the investor's payroll. The other half won't care about a broken-down warehouse in the workers' district. No, this is exactly what they wanted, to scare us into silence." "Then we don't go silent." Marcus's voice hardened. "We get louder. We move faster. We hit them before they can hit us again." Eliza turned to face him, searching his eyes for any hint of wavering. Instead, she found only grim determination and something else, anger as fierce as her own. "I finished the ownership research," Marcus continued. "The consortium that controls the mills consists of 7 investors. 3 of them are names you'd recognize: Lord Pemberton, Sir Edmund Blackwood, and my brother Adrian." The last name hit Eliza like a physical blow. "Adrian? But he told me he had nothing to do with the mill operations." "He owns a 20% stake," Marcus said quietly. "Second largest shareholder after Pemberton. The dividends from those mills funded his officers' commission, fund his lifestyle. He may not oversee daily operations, but his money is built on that suffering just as surely as if he ran the looms himself." Eliza sank onto one of the few unbroken chairs, feeling betrayed and foolish. All those months of Adrian's courtship, his gentle concern, his claims that he wanted nothing to do with the brutal business his family had built, and all the while he'd been profiting from the very exploitation she fought against. "There's more," Marcus said, crouching beside her. "I found the financial records for the past 3 years. The investors have been systematically falsifying safety reports, manipulating wage calculations, and deliberately understaffing to maximize profit margins. They're clearing 40% returns annually while workers die of white lung and children lose limbs to machines." He opened his notebook, showing her pages of meticulous documentation, dates, figures, names, all cross-referenced and verified. The evidence was damning, undeniable. "This is enough," Eliza whispered. "This could force reform, prosecution even. If we can get it in front of people who care." Marcus stood, offering her his hand. "Which is why tomorrow morning I'm confronting the investors directly. All 7 of them, at their quarterly meeting." Eliza took his hand and rose, her mind racing. "They'll deny everything, claim the records are forged. Then we'll need witnesses, workers willing to testify to the conditions, to contradict the official reports." Marcus paused, his expression troubled. "But I won't ask anyone to take that risk without understanding the consequences. The investors will retaliate. Anyone who speaks out could lose their job, their housing, everything." "They've already lost everything," Eliza said quietly. "They're dying by inches in those mills. Some of them might choose to fight back if they thought it could actually change something." Marcus studied her face. "You think they'd testify, even knowing the risks?" "I think we should ask them. Tonight. Give them the choice." Within 2 hours, Eliza had gathered 15 workers in Mary Sullivan's cramped tenement room. They sat on the floor, on the single bed, pressed shoulder to shoulder in a space meant for one person. Thomas Brennan, Catherine Doyle, Peter Walsh, all the regulars from dance class, plus others who'd heard whispers about what Marcus was uncovering. The air was thick with tension and body heat as Marcus laid out what he'd discovered. He didn't soften the truth or pretty up the numbers. He showed them exactly how much profit the investors extracted annually, how that profit came directly from stolen wages and ignored safety violations, how the system was designed to grind them down while enriching men who'd never set foot in a factory. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Finally, Mary spoke, her voice weak but steady. "What happens if we testify? Specifically." "You'll likely be fired," Marcus said bluntly, "blacklisted from other mill work. The investors control most of the industrial jobs in Cork, and they'll make sure anyone who speaks against them can't find employment elsewhere." "So we starve," Thomas said flatly. "Not if I can help it." Marcus pulled out a folded document. "I've established a fund, money set aside specifically to support any worker who loses their position as a result of testifying. It's not charity, it's payment for the courage to tell the truth. 6 months of wages guaranteed, plus assistance finding new employment outside the investor's control." Murmurs rippled through the crowded room. Catherine leaned forward, suspicion written across her tired face. "Why would you do that? What's in it for you, Lord Vale?" "Redemption, maybe." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Or just the satisfaction of burning down a system that should have never existed. I won't lie to you and claim I'm purely altruistic. Part of me wants to hurt the men who deceived me, who used my family's name to legitimize their exploitation. But another part, a larger part, simply can't unsee what I've witnessed. Can't accept that this is how things have to be." "Pretty speech," Peter Walsh muttered. "But talk is cheap. How do we know you'll actually follow through? That you won't abandon us the moment things get difficult?" Before Marcus could respond, Eliza spoke up. "You don't. You can't know for certain. But I can tell you that I've watched him spend the past week documenting conditions that made him physically sick. I've seen him risk his own reputation and relationships to gather this evidence. And I've seen him get angrier with each new horror he uncovers. That doesn't guarantee he won't fail us, but it suggests he's genuine." The workers exchanged glances, communicating silently. Mary coughed, a wet, rattling sound that went on too long. And when she could speak again, her voice was resolute. "I'll testify. I'm dying anyway from white lung. Might as well make my death mean something." "Mary, no," Thomas protested. "Your daughter needs—" "My daughter needs to grow up in a world where women don't die coughing up their lungs because rich men value profit over human life," Mary interrupted. "I'll testify." One by one, others raised their hands. Thomas, still reluctant but loyal to Mary. Catherine, her jaw set with determination. Peter and his wife. By the end, 12 workers had volunteered to stand before the investors and speak the truth. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from fierce, painful pride. These people had so little, had already sacrificed so much, and yet they were willing to risk the little they had left for the chance at justice. Marcus looked humbled and grim. "I promise you," he said quietly, "I will not let your courage be wasted. Tomorrow, we make them listen. We make them answer for what they've done." The meeting broke up near midnight, workers slipping away in ones and twos to avoid attracting attention. Eliza and Marcus were the last to leave, stepping out into a cold drizzle that matched the weight pressing on Eliza's chest. "What if it's not enough?" she asked as they walked through the dark streets. "What if we confront them and they simply don't care?" "Then we make it public," Marcus replied. "I've already contacted a journalist at the Cork Examiner, a man named Fitzpatrick who's been investigating labor conditions for years. If the investors refuse to reform, Fitzpatrick will publish everything, the evidence, the testimony, all of it." "And your brother?" Eliza asked quietly. "Adrian is one of those investors. You'd destroy him too?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. Adrian made his choice when he invested in those mills, when he accepted profits built on suffering. "I love my brother, but I won't protect him from the consequences of his own decisions." There was pain in his voice, but also steel. Eliza realized that whatever happened tomorrow, Marcus had already crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd chosen the workers over his own family, justice over comfort, and that choice would define the rest of his life. They reached Merchant Street, and Marcus paused at the corner where they usually parted ways. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and intense, "if something goes wrong tomorrow, if the investors retaliate more seriously than I expect, I need you to promise me you'll take the evidence to Fitzpatrick. Don't try to protect me or salvage the situation. Just get the truth published. Fear spiked through her. What do you think they'll do? I don't know. But men with that much to lose can be unpredictable. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with unexpected tenderness. Promise me. The touch sent electricity through her despite the gravity of the moment. She realized with sudden clarity that sometime during their partnership, her feelings toward Marcus had shifted from suspicion to respect to something far more complicated and dangerous. I promise, she whispered. Marcus held her gaze for another heartbeat, something unspoken passing between them. Then he stepped back, the moment broken. Get some rest. Tomorrow changes everything. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Eliza standing alone in the rain, her heart pounding and her mind churning with possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. The investors' meeting took place in a private room at the Imperial Hotel, Cork's most prestigious establishment. Eliza waited in the lobby, her hands clenched in her lap, while Marcus went upstairs with his evidence and his accusations. She'd wanted to accompany him, but Marcus had insisted this first confrontation needed to be private. Investor to investor, man to man, giving them the opportunity to do the right thing before public exposure became necessary. Eliza had reluctantly agreed, though every instinct screamed that letting Marcus face those men alone was a mistake. An hour passed, then another. Eliza watched the ornate clock on the wall tick forward with agonizing slowness. Other hotel guests came and went, casting curious glances at the working-class woman sitting in their gilded lobby, but she ignored them all. Finally, movement on the grand staircase. But it wasn't Marcus who descended. It was Adrian. He saw her immediately, his handsome face tight with an emotion she couldn't read. He crossed the lobby quickly, his military bearing making other guests step aside automatically. "Eliza," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk. Outside." "I'm waiting for Marcus." "Marcus is fine. Or as fine as he can be after accusing his own brother of profiting from murder." Adrian's tone turned bitter. "Please, Eliza. 5 minutes." Against her better judgment, she followed him through the hotel's side entrance into a small courtyard. The moment they were alone, Adrian rounded on her. "Did you know he was going to do this? Ambush us with accusations and demands?" "It's not an ambush if the accusations are true," Eliza shot back. "You own 20% of mills that are killing people, Adrian. You told me you had nothing to do with the family business." "I don't. I never visit the mills, never participate in management decisions." "But you take the money." Eliza's voice cracked. "You take the profits built on child labor and dying workers, and you use that blood money to fund your comfortable life. You courted me with flowers bought with wages stolen from people like Mary Sullivan. How is that not being involved?" Adrian flinched, as if she'd struck him. I never thought about where the money actually came from. The dividends just appeared in my account quarterly. You thought you could remain innocent by remaining ignorant," Eliza interrupted. "But ignorance, when you have the power to know, is just another form of guilt." "Perhaps you're right." Adrian's shoulders slumped. "Perhaps I am guilty. But Marcus, what he's proposing upstairs, it will destroy the investors financially, destroy our family's standing in society. And for what? You think the workers will actually benefit from the mills being shut down?" "The mills won't be shut down," Eliza said, "just reformed. Safety measures implemented, fair wages paid, basic human dignity restored." "You're naive if you think it's that simple." Adrian stepped closer, urgency creeping into his voice. "The other investors are furious. Pemberton is talking about having Marcus arrested for theft of proprietary documents. Blackwood wants him declared mentally unsound and committed. They will fight this with everything they have, and they will destroy anyone who stands with him, including you." "Let them try." "Eliza, please." Adrian reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I care about you. I don't want to see you hurt because my brother has decided to wage some noble crusade that can't possibly succeed." "Can't succeed? Or you don't want it to succeed?" Eliza challenged. "Because there's a difference, Adrian. One means you're a pessimist. The other means you're a coward." Pain flashed across Adrian's face. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm a coward?" "I think," Eliza said quietly, that you're a good man who's chosen comfort over courage, and I think that choice will haunt you for the rest of your life." Before Adrian could respond, shouting erupted from inside the hotel. Eliza ran back through the door, Adrian close behind, and found the lobby in chaos. Marcus stood near the staircase, his face bleeding from a split lip, his coat torn. 3 large men surrounded him, private security, by the look of them, while a well-dressed older man with silver hair and cold eyes directed them with sharp gestures. "Lord Pemberton, this is assault," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the lobby despite his obvious injuries, "in front of witnesses." "This is ejection of a madman from private premises," Pemberton replied smoothly. "You burst into a legitimate business meeting making wild accusations, threatening exposure based on forged documents. We had no choice but to remove you for everyone's safety." "Forged?" Marcus laughed harshly. "Those are your own financial records, your own falsified safety reports, your signatures on documents authorizing payment of wages below legal minimums." "Prove it," Pemberton smiled coldly. "Oh wait, you can't, because I notice you no longer have your precious notebook. Where did that go, I wonder?" Marcus's hand went instinctively to his coat, and Eliza saw the pocket was empty. They'd taken the evidence. All of it. Horror and fury warred in her chest as she pushed through the gathering crowd. "Give it back. That documentation belongs—" "To no one," a new voice interrupted. Sir Edmund Blackwood emerged from the staircase, Marcus's notebook in his hands. "Because it doesn't exist anymore." He held up the notebook, and Eliza saw the pages had been torn out. Blackwood produced a match, struck it, and touched the flame to the crumpled papers. They caught immediately, burning bright and fast, 3 weeks of meticulous investigation turning to ash in seconds. "No!" Marcus lunged forward, but the security men grabbed him, holding him back as the evidence burned. Pemberton watched the fire with satisfaction. "Here's what's going to happen, Lord Vale. You will cease this ridiculous crusade immediately. You will tell your worker friends that you made a mistake, that you misunderstood what you saw, and you will never speak of this matter again." "Or what?" Marcus demanded, still struggling against the men restraining him. "Or the workers who agreed to testify will find themselves unemployed and unemployable," Blackwood said pleasantly. "Their housing will be terminated. Their families will starve. We have their names. Your notebook was quite thorough on that point. Every single person who agreed to stand against us can be destroyed with a word." "You can't." "We can and we will." Pemberton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You may be Lord Vale, but you're also a younger son with no real power of your own. Your family name protects you from physical harm, but it won't protect your workers. So choose, Marcus, your pride or their lives." The security men released Marcus and stepped back. He stood there, breathing hard, blood dripping from his split lip onto his torn coat, and Eliza saw the terrible calculation happening behind his eyes. If he backed down, the workers would be safe, but nothing would change. The mills would continue grinding people to death, the investors would continue profiting, and justice would be deferred indefinitely. But if he pushed forward, 12 families would lose everything: housing, income, hope. Mary Sullivan would die in the streets instead of in her bed. Thomas Brennan's children would starve. It was an impossible choice, and the investors knew it. Eliza saw the moment Marcus started to break, to surrender. She saw his shoulders begin to slump, saw defeat creeping into his eyes, and she couldn't let it happen. Couldn't let these smug, powerful men win simply because they were willing to hurt innocent people to maintain their profits. "You're forgetting something," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Every eye turned to her. Pemberton's expression shifted to dismissive irritation. "And who are you?" "Eliza Harrow, dance instructor, and the person who made copies of every page in that notebook." It was a complete lie. She had no copies, no backup evidence, but she said it with such conviction that doubt flickered across Pemberton's face. "You're bluffing," Blackwood said, but he sounded uncertain. "Am I?" Eliza smiled coldly. "Would you like to take that chance? Because I've already given one set of copies to a journalist at the Cork Examiner. If Marcus or I disappear, if any of the workers who volunteered to testify are mysteriously fired or harmed, those documents will be published immediately. Every falsified report, every stolen wage, every name of every investor who profited from this system. You have no proof, Pemberton snarled. No one will believe. They'll believe worker testimony, Eliza interrupted. They'll believe photographs of children crawling under running looms. They'll believe death certificates showing patterns of white lung disease among your employees. And they'll believe financial records showing 40% profit margins built on suffering. Even if you discredit the documents themselves, the story will spread. The scandal will stick. Your reputations will be ruined. She was making it up as she went along, building a house of cards on pure audacity. But she saw the investors exchange glances, saw uncertainty begin to crack their confident facades. Marcus caught on immediately. Miss Harrow is correct. We anticipated you might try to suppress the evidence, so we took precautions. The question now is whether you want this to end quietly through reform or publicly through exposure and prosecution. Pemberton's face had gone red with fury. This is extortion. No, Marcus said quietly. This is justice. You have until Monday to make your choice. Implement the reforms I outlined upstairs, safety measures, fair wages, worker representation, or face public ruin. Those are your options. He offered Eliza his arm, and she took it, fighting to keep her hand from trembling. Together they walked through the stunned crowd, through the hotel lobby, and out into the cold afternoon air. They made it 2 blocks before Marcus stopped abruptly, pulling her into an alley. Please tell me you actually made copies, he said urgently. I didn't, Eliza admitted. I have nothing. It was a complete bluff. Marcus stared at her, and then, impossibly, he started to laugh. Deep, genuine laughter that echoed off the alley walls and made passers-by glance over curiously. You're insane, he said, still laughing. Brilliant and absolutely insane. You just threatened some of the most powerful men in Cork with evidence that doesn't exist. It worked, didn't it? Eliza said, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst. They believed me. For now. But when they calm down and think it through, they'll realize it was a bluff. And then his laughter died. Then they'll retaliate harder than before. They'll know we have nothing to fight back with. The reality of what she'd done crashed over Eliza like a wave. She'd bought them time, but at the cost of making the investors even more determined to crush them. And she'd dragged 12 workers and their families deeper into danger based on a lie. We need actual evidence, she said, thinking frantically. Actual copies of those documents, photographs, something tangible before Monday. The financial records were in their office, Marcus said. They'll have burned or hidden them by now. Then we find different evidence. The mills themselves, there must be documentation there. Ledgers, timesheets, accident reports. Heavily guarded, especially now. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, wincing as the movement pulled at his split lip. But there is one place that might have what we need. The investor's legal office. They file quarterly reports there, keep copies of all official documentation for tax purposes. Can you access it? Not legally. It would require breaking in, theft. Marcus met her eyes. If we're caught, it's not just scandal. It's criminal prosecution, prison. Eliza thought about Mary Sullivan dying by inches, about children losing fingers to machines, about Bridget Murphy's orphaned children, about all the workers who'd trusted them enough to volunteer testimony despite the risks. Then we don't get caught, she said. Marcus studied her face for a long moment. You're sure? Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I crossed that line the moment I agreed to help you investigate, Eliza replied. The only question is whether we're brave enough to see it through. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, surprise giving way to respect, respect deepening into something more intense. He reached out, his hand cupping her face as it had the night before, and this time Eliza didn't pull away. If we do this, he said quietly, if we actually succeed in bringing them down, it will change everything. Your life, my life, the entire social structure of this city. Good, Eliza whispered. It needs changing. Marcus smiled, a real smile, not the cold mask he usually wore, and for a moment, standing in that dirty alley with danger closing in from all sides, Eliza felt more alive than she had in years. Tonight then, Marcus said. Midnight. The legal office is on King Street. I'll be there. He released her reluctantly, and they parted ways, each disappearing into the crowded streets. Eliza walked home in a daze, her mind spinning with plans and possibilities, and the terrifying awareness that she'd just committed to committing a serious crime. But when she arrived home and found a note slipped under her door, all thoughts of the break-in fled. The message was brief, written in an elegant hand on expensive paper. Miss Harrow, your dance students have been terminated, effective immediately. Their housing will be forfeit by week's end. This is what happens to traitors. P. Eliza's hands shook as she read and reread the note. P. Pemberton. He'd already started his retaliation, punishing the workers for agreeing to testify. 12 families suddenly without income or shelter because she and Marcus had given them hope. She had to fix this. Had to make the break-in tonight work. Had to get evidence strong enough to force the investors to not just reform, but to rehire the fired workers, to undo the damage they'd already done. Failure was no longer an option. It never had been. But now the stakes had crystallized into something sharp and urgent. Eliza folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Then she went to her room and began preparing for midnight, her fear hardening into cold determination. The investors wanted a war? They would get one. Midnight found Eliza pressed against the cold brick wall of King Street, her heart hammering as she watched the legal offices across the cobblestones. The building stood 3 stories tall, its windows dark except for a single lamp burning in the ground floor vestibule where a night watchman sat reading a newspaper. Marcus materialized from the shadows beside her so quietly she nearly gasped. He wore all black, his face obscured by the brim of a cap, and carried a leather satchel that clinked softly with what she assumed were tools for breaking and entering. "One guard," he whispered. "Front entrance only. There's a service door in the back that should be unlocked. The cleaning staff uses it." "Should be?" Eliza hissed back. "What if it's not?" Then I picked the lock. Marcus pulled a thin metal instrument from his pocket. "Army training. I learned all sorts of useful skills during the war." They moved through the alley, keeping to the deepest shadows, until they reached the service entrance. Marcus tried the handle first. Locked. He knelt, inserting his picks into the mechanism with steady hands while Eliza kept watch, every nerve screaming that someone would spot them, that this insane plan would collapse before it even began. The lock clicked. Marcus eased the door open and they slipped inside, closing it silently behind them. The darkness inside was absolute and suffocating. Eliza felt Marcus take her hand, squeezing once for reassurance, then guiding her forward with careful steps. They climbed stairs by feel, each creak of old wood making her flinch. 2nd floor. 3rd. Finally, Marcus stopped, releasing her hand to strike a match. The brief flare of light revealed a corridor lined with office doors, each bearing brass nameplates. Marcus moved to the one marked Pemberton and Associates and went to work on the lock while Eliza held the match, trying to keep her hand from shaking. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room. Marcus lit a small oil lamp, keeping the flame low, and began systematically searching drawers. "What exactly are we looking for?" Eliza whispered, moving to the filing cabinets. "Quarterly reports filed with the tax authority," Marcus replied, his voice barely audible. "They can't falsify those without committing fraud against the government, so they'll have the real numbers. Actual production costs, actual wages paid, actual safety expenditures." Eliza pulled open the first cabinet drawer and found it packed with files organized by date. She began searching through them, looking for anything marked with the mill's names or the consortium's holdings. They worked in tense silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional soft curse when a drawer stuck or a file proved irrelevant. Minutes stretched into an hour. Eliza's hands grew cramped from flipping through endless documents, her eyes straining in the dim light. Then Marcus made a sound of triumph. "Here," he breathed, pulling a thick folder from the bottom drawer of Pemberton's desk. "Tax filings for the past 5 years. Complete financial breakdowns for all consortium holdings, including the mills." He spread the documents on the desk, and even by lamplight, the numbers told a damning story. Production costs listed as twice their actual amount. Safety equipment purchases that never happened. Wages reported to tax authorities that were 30% higher than what workers actually received. The investors had been defrauding both their workers and the government, pocketing the difference while filing false reports to avoid scrutiny. "This is it," Eliza said, her hands trembling as she held pages showing side-by-side comparisons of reported versus actual expenditures. "This proves everything, the wage theft, the falsified safety records, all of it." Marcus was already carefully removing documents from the folder, organizing them by category. "We'll need to copy the most critical pages. I brought paper and pencils. If we work fast, we can—" The sound of footsteps on the stairs froze them both. Marcus extinguished the lamp instantly, plunging them into darkness. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by voices. 2 men, maybe 3, climbing toward the 3rd floor. "Check Pemberton's office first," a voice commanded. "Vale was asking too many questions about the tax filings. If he tries to steal them tonight, that's where he'll go." Eliza felt Marcus's hand find hers in the darkness, squeezing tight. They were trapped. The office had only one door, and it opened onto the corridor where the men were approaching. No windows large enough to escape through. No other exit. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A key scraped in the lock. Marcus pulled Eliza down behind the desk just as the door swung open and lamplight flooded the room. Through the gap beneath the desk, Eliza could see 3 pairs of boots enter, 2 wearing the practical shoes of hired security, 1 in expensive leather that could only belong to an investor. "Well?" Pemberton's voice, cold and authoritative. "Anyone here?" "Appears empty, my lord," one of the guards replied. "Search it anyway. Vale is desperate enough to try something foolish, and if he's recruited that Harrow woman to help him, they might already be inside." The boots moved around the room, drawers opening and closing. Eliza pressed herself against Marcus, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. Whether for comfort or to keep her still, she couldn't tell. A boot appeared inches from her face as one guard circled the desk. Any moment now, he would look down, would see them huddled there like children playing hide-and-seek. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He squeezed her shoulder once, hard, and exploded from their hiding place. "Run!" he shouted, shoving the desk forward into the nearest guard's legs. The man went down with a curse. Marcus grabbed the oil lamp from the other guard's hand and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered and spread burning oil across the floor. In the sudden chaos of flame and shouting, he grabbed Eliza's wrist and yanked her toward the door. They burst into the corridor with Pemberton's enraged voice ringing behind them. The second guard lunged, catching Marcus's coat, but Marcus twisted free, leaving the man holding empty fabric. They hit the stairs at a run, taking them 3 at a time, Eliza's skirts tangling around her legs as she struggled to keep pace. Behind them, boots pounded in pursuit. Angry voices shouted orders. The smell of smoke began to drift down from the 3rd floor. They reached the ground floor and Marcus steered them not toward the service entrance but toward the front, where the night watchman was just rising from his chair, confused by the commotion. Marcus didn't slow. He lowered his shoulder and hit the door at full speed, smashing through it with Eliza right behind him. The night air hit her face like a slap. They sprinted down King Street, cutting through alleys, vaulting over obstacles, running until Eliza's lungs burned and her legs trembled. Behind them, the pursuit continued but grew more distant. Finally, Marcus pulled her into a recessed doorway, both of them gasping for breath, pressed together in the small space. Eliza could feel his heart hammering against her shoulder, could see the wild gleam of adrenaline in his eyes. "The documents," she panted. "Did you—" Marcus patted his coat and his face fell. "I dropped them. When I shoved the desk, the papers scattered. I'm sorry, Eliza. I had to choose between the evidence and getting you out safely." The disappointment was crushing. They'd been so close, had the proof in their hands. And now it was gone, probably burning in the fire Marcus had started, or back in Pemberton's possession with the investors more alert than ever. But then Eliza remembered the weight in her own pockets. When Marcus had been organizing the documents on the desk, she'd folded several of the most damning pages and tucked them into her skirt. Just a precaution, in case something went wrong. She pulled out 3 crumpled sheets, tax filings showing the discrepancies between reported and actual wages, safety equipment purchases that existed only on paper, and a signed memorandum from Pemberton instructing his accountants to adjust the numbers for maximum tax advantage. Marcus stared at the papers, then at her, wonder and disbelief warring on his face. "You magnificent, brilliant woman," he breathed. "You saved it. You saved everything." Before Eliza could respond, he pulled her into a fierce embrace, then kissed her, hard and desperate and tasting of smoke and victory. Eliza kissed him back, her hands fisting in his torn shirt, months of tension and fear and growing attraction combusting into this single moment of reckless relief. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably run," he said. "They'll be searching the streets." "Probably," Eliza agreed, but neither of them moved. Finally, reluctantly, they separated. Marcus took her hand and led her through a maze of back alleys toward the docks, away from King Street and the investors' vengeful hunt. They emerged near the warehouse where Eliza used to teach dance, its door still hanging broken from the earlier attack. "We need to get these documents somewhere safe," Marcus said, studying the papers Eliza had rescued. "And then we need to—" A figure stepped from the shadows of the warehouse, and both of them jumped. But it wasn't Pemberton or his guards. It was Mary Sullivan, wrapped in a thin shawl, her face gaunt in the moonlight. "Mary?" Eliza moved toward her friend. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." Mary's voice was weak but determined. "Came by earlier and saw what they'd done to our dance hall. Then I heard the investors fired all of us today. Thought you should know some of the others are getting angry." "Angry how?" Marcus asked carefully. Mary's expression hardened. "Thomas and Peter, they're talking about fighting back. Not with testimony or evidence, with fire and fists. They're gathering workers at the Black Swan Tavern right now, making plans to burn down Victoria Mill tomorrow night." Horror flooded Eliza. "No, that's exactly what the investors want. Proof that workers are dangerous radicals who need to be controlled." "Try telling them that," Mary said. "They're past caring about optics or strategy. They just want to hurt the people who've been hurting them." Marcus swore under his breath. "If they burn the mill, people will die. Workers on the night shift, anyone trapped inside. It'll be a massacre, and public opinion will turn completely against labor reform." "Then stop them," Mary said simply. "You started this by giving them hope that justice was possible. Now that hope's been crushed, they're choosing violence instead. So either find a way to restore that hope or accept what's coming." She turned to leave, but Eliza caught her arm. "Mary, wait. We have evidence. Real evidence that can force the investors to accept reform." Mary looked at the crumpled papers Eliza held, skepticism written across her tired face. "You said that before. And then the investors burned your proof and fired us anyway." "This is different," Marcus insisted. "These are government tax filings. The investors can't claim they're forgeries without admitting they committed fraud against the Crown. With these documents, we can force prosecution, not just reforms." "And how long will that take?" Mary demanded. "Weeks? Months?" "We don't have months, Lord Vale. We have until tomorrow night before Thomas and the others do something terrible. So unless you can waive those papers and make everything better by dawn, I don't think it matters." She pulled free from Eliza's grasp and walked away, her hunched figure disappearing into the darkness. Eliza and Marcus stood in silence, the weight of what they'd learned pressing down like a physical force. "She's right," Eliza said finally. "We can't wait for the legal system to grind through prosecution. We need immediate action, something dramatic enough to stop the violence and force the investors to capitulate." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "There is one thing. Dangerous. Possibly illegal. Definitely something I can't take back once I do it. Tell me." "The investors' quarterly meeting reconvenes tomorrow afternoon at the Imperial Hotel. All 7 of them, plus their lawyers and accountants. Closed session to discuss how to handle our investigation and the worker unrest." Marcus pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time. "In approximately 14 hours. So I crashed that meeting, in front of witnesses, journalists, city officials, anyone I can rally on short notice. I present the evidence publicly, name names, and offer the investors one final choice: implement immediate reforms or face criminal prosecution for tax fraud." Eliza felt a chill run through her. "They'll destroy you. Your reputation, your family name, everything." "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But it might work. Public exposure backed by undeniable evidence with enough witnesses that they can't suppress it. Force their hand before the workers resort to violence. And if it doesn't work? If they still refuse? Marcus's expression turned grim. Then at least we'll have tried everything. And when Thomas burns Victoria Mill tomorrow night, the world will know exactly whose greed drove workers to such desperation. It was a terrible plan built on desperation and slim hope. But looking at Marcus's determined face, Eliza realized it was also their only option. They'd pushed the investors into a corner, and cornered men were dangerous. The only way forward was to push harder, to force a resolution before the violence Mary predicted became inevitable. "All right," she said, "tomorrow afternoon. But I'm coming with you." "Eliza, no arguments. You said it yourself. We need witnesses, people to corroborate what's presented. I can testify to the conditions I saw at Victoria Mill. Mary and the others can too. If we can convince them, this will actually work." Marcus studied her face, then nodded slowly. "We'll need help organizing it. Someone with influence who can ensure the right people attend." "Fitzpatrick," Eliza said. "The journalist you mentioned. If he's really been investigating labor conditions, this is exactly the kind of story he'd want to cover." "First thing in the morning, then? We contact Fitzpatrick, brief him on everything, and ask him to spread word of a major announcement at the Imperial Hotel tomorrow afternoon." They spent the next hour planning, working out details and contingencies until exhaustion finally forced them to separate. Marcus walked Eliza home, both of them jumping at shadows, expecting Pemberton's guards to appear at any moment. But the streets remained quiet, and when they reached Merchant Street, it was nearly 3 in the morning. "Get some sleep," Marcus said, though he looked like sleep was the last thing on his mind. "Tomorrow changes everything." "It already has," Eliza replied, thinking of that kiss in the doorway, of Mary's warning about violence, of the impossible gamble they were about to take. She watched Marcus disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, then let herself inside, moving quietly so as not to wake her father. In her room, she laid the rescued documents on her small desk and studied them by candlelight. 3 pieces of paper, that's all they had. 3 crumpled sheets against the combined power and wealth of 7 investors who controlled half of Cork's industry. It should have felt hopeless. Instead, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt since this whole ordeal began: actual, genuine hope. Not the fragile hope she'd been trying to cultivate in her dance students, but something harder and more resilient. The hope that came from having a concrete plan, real evidence, and a partner willing to risk everything. She thought about Marcus, cold, pragmatic Lord Vale, who'd argued against giving workers hope because hope was dangerous, who'd spent weeks documenting suffering that made him physically ill, who'd just chosen to sacrifice his reputation and possibly his freedom to prevent violence and force justice. When had he stopped being the enemy and become something else entirely? When had respect turned into trust, and trust into something deeper and more complicated? Eliza didn't have answers. But as she finally blew out the candle and lay down to catch a few hours of sleep, she knew tomorrow would either prove their partnership worthwhile or destroy them both. Either way, there was no turning back. Morning came too soon, gray and cold. Eliza woke to find a note slipped under her door. Marcus's neat handwriting informing her he'd contacted Fitzpatrick, and the journalist had agreed to help spread word of the afternoon's confrontation. City council members would attend. Representatives from other labor organizations, even a few sympathetic businessmen who'd been quietly critical of the consortium's practices. It was happening. In 6 hours, they would stand before the investors and their allies and force a reckoning. Eliza dressed carefully, choosing her most respectable outfit, a dark blue dress with minimal ornamentation that would help her look serious and credible rather than like the working-class dance instructor she was. She pinned her hair severely back, studied her reflection, and barely recognized the determined woman staring back at her. Her father intercepted her as she headed for the door. "Eliza," he said quietly, worry creasing his face. "Where are you going? What's happening? You've been strange for weeks now, sneaking around at all hours, and now Lord Vale is sending you notes." "I'm trying to fix something that's broken," Eliza replied, kissing his cheek. "I can't explain more right now, but I promise I'll tell you everything tonight." "Will you be safe?" She thought about the investors' fury, about Pemberton's threats, about the very real possibility that today's confrontation could end with her arrested or worse. "I'll try to be." It wasn't the reassurance he wanted, but it was all she could give. She left before he could press further, heading toward the warehouse district where she'd asked Mary and the others to meet her. They were all there when she arrived, not just the 12 who'd volunteered to testify, but dozens more. Word had spread through the worker community about the firings, about the investors' retaliation, about Thomas's plan for violence. The warehouse was packed with angry, frightened people demanding answers. Eliza climbed onto an overturned crate so everyone could see her, her heart pounding as all eyes turned her direction. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice carrying across the crowded space. "I know you're scared. You trusted me and Lord Vale, and now you've lost your jobs because of it. You have every right to want revenge." "Damn right we do," someone shouted from the back. "The investors drew first blood. Now we finish it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eliza saw Thomas near the front, his face set with grim determination, and Peter beside him looking equally resolved. "If you burn Victoria Mill tonight," Eliza continued, raising her voice, "innocent people will die. Workers on the night shift, maybe families in neighboring tenements if the fire spreads. And the investors will use those deaths to justify crushing every labor movement in Cork. They'll paint you as violent radicals, and they'll win public support for even harsher measures." "So what's the alternative?" Mary called out, her weak voice somehow cutting through the noise. "We tried your way. We tried testimony and evidence. Look where it got us." "The alternative," Eliza said, "is to try one more time. This afternoon at the Imperial Hotel, Lord Vale and I are confronting the investors publicly, with witnesses, with evidence they can't deny or destroy. We're going to force them to choose between immediate reform or criminal prosecution." The crowd's muttering grew louder, skeptical and angry. "We've heard promises before," Catherine Doyle said bitterly. "What makes this different?" "This." Eliza pulled out the tax documents and held them high. "Government filings showing exactly how the investors defrauded both you and the Crown. Proof that will stand up in any court. If they refuse reform after this is made public, they face prison. That's the leverage we needed, and we have it now." She saw doubt begin to crack through the anger, saw people exchange glances, reconsidering their plans for violence. "All I'm asking," Eliza pressed, "is that you give us until tonight. Let us try this final confrontation. If it fails, if the investors still refuse to reform after being publicly exposed, then I won't stop you from doing what you think is necessary. But give us this one chance first, please." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then Thomas stepped forward, his bandaged hand clenched into a fist. "What happens at this meeting?" he demanded. "Who speaks? Who presents the evidence?" "Lord Vale will present the financial documents and outline the required reforms," Eliza explained. "I'll testify about the conditions I witnessed at Victoria Mill, and I'm hoping some of you will agree to testify as well. Not formally like we planned before, just tell your stories. Let the public see what these mills have done to real people." "And if the investors retaliate again?" Peter asked. "If they come after us for speaking?" "Then they do it in front of journalists and city officials and witnesses who will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of men they are," Eliza replied. "They can't silence all of us. Not anymore." More silence. Then Mary climbed slowly onto a crate beside Eliza, her breathing labored from the effort. "I'll testify," she said, her voice carrying despite its weakness. "Miss Eliza and Lord Vale, they've risked everything for us. Least we can do is give them this one more chance." She looked out over the crowd, her gaze fierce. "And if it doesn't work, if the investors still won't listen after being exposed, then tomorrow we burn it all down." A cheer went up, angry and determined. One by one, others volunteered, Thomas, Catherine, Peter, eventually a dozen workers agreeing to stand before the investors and speak their truth. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Thank you, all of you. Meet us at the Imperial Hotel at 2:00. We end this today." As the crowd dispersed, Mary caught Eliza's arm. "You know this is our last hope, right? If this doesn't work, there's no stopping what comes next." "I know," Eliza said quietly, "but I have to believe it will work, that justice is actually possible." Mary smiled sadly. That's the difference between you and me, Miss Eliza. You still have hope. I just have rage. But I suppose we'll see which one changes the world, he said. The Imperial Hotel's grand ballroom was packed by the time Eliza arrived at 1:45. Fitzpatrick had done his work well. Journalists from 3 different newspapers occupied the front rows, notebooks ready. City council members clustered near the windows, looking uncomfortable but curious. Even a few labor organizers from Dublin had made the journey after hearing rumors of a major development. And there, at the center of the room on a raised platform, sat the 7 investors, Pemberton in the middle, flanked by Blackwood and the others, all wearing expressions of cold fury. Adrian sat at the far end, his face pale and strained, carefully avoiding Eliza's gaze. Marcus stood near the platform, dressed formally, his split lip from the previous night's fight healing, but still visible. When he saw Eliza, relief flooded his features. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly as she joined him. "I wasn't sure either," Eliza admitted. "This is insane, Marcus. We're about to accuse some of the most powerful men in Ireland of fraud and exploitation in front of half the city." "I know." Marcus took her hand, squeezing gently. "But we're doing it together. That counts for something." The workers began filing in. Mary, Thomas, Catherine, all 12 who'd volunteered, their working-class clothes standing out starkly among the well-dressed attendees. They moved to the side of the room, forming a silent wall of witnesses. At precisely 2:00, Marcus stepped onto the platform. The room fell silent. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clear and strong, "thank you for attending. I've called this gathering to address a matter of urgent public concern regarding labor conditions at the textile mills operated by the Cork Industrial Consortium." "This is a private business meeting," Pemberton interrupted coldly. "You have no right—" "I have every right," Marcus cut him off. "As do these journalists, these city officials, and these workers who've suffered under your negligence and greed. You can listen to what I have to say, or you can walk out. But if you walk out, everything I'm about to reveal will be published in tomorrow's newspapers anyway. Your choice." The investors exchanged glances. None of them moved. Marcus nodded and continued. "For the past month, I've been investigating conditions at the consortium's 4 textile mills. What I've found is a systematic pattern of exploitation, safety violations, and financial fraud designed to maximize investor profits while minimizing worker welfare and legal accountability." He pulled out the documents Eliza had rescued and held them high. "These are tax filings submitted by the consortium to His Majesty's Revenue. They show reported safety equipment expenditures of £40,000 over the past 5 years. However, actual purchases, verified through manufacturer records, total less than £8,000. The difference was pocketed by the investors while workers operated machines without basic safety guards." Murmuring erupted through the crowd. The journalists scribbled furiously. "Similarly," Marcus continued, "wages reported to tax authorities average 18 shillings per week per worker. Actual wages paid confirmed by these workers' testimony," he gestured to the group by the wall, "average 12 shillings. Again, the investors claimed higher costs for tax purposes while paying workers far less and pocketing the difference." "This is slander," Blackwood snarled, half rising from his chair. "Those documents are fabricated—" "They're your own tax filings," Marcus replied calmly. "Submitted under penalty of perjury to the Crown, unless you're claiming you defrauded the government?" Blackwood's face went purple, but he sat back down. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes methodically laying out the evidence: the falsified safety reports, the illegal employment of children, the pattern of intimidation against workers who complained. With each revelation, the journalist's pens moved faster, and the city officials looked more disturbed. Finally, Marcus set down the documents and faced the investors directly. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "Implement immediate reforms. Fair wages, proper safety equipment, worker representation, and reinstatement of the employees you fired in retaliation for cooperating with this investigation, or face criminal prosecution for tax fraud, which these documents prove beyond doubt." "You're blackmailing us," Pemberton said, his voice tight with rage. "I'm offering you justice or consequences," Marcus corrected. "The choice is yours. But I need your answer now, in front of these witnesses." The investors huddled together, whispering urgently. Eliza watched Adrian's face during the deliberation, saw him arguing with the others, saw Pemberton's angry gestures. Finally, They broke apart. "We need time to review these allegations," Pemberton said carefully. "To consult with our legal counsel." "No," Marcus interrupted. "You've had time, you've had chances, you've had warnings. Now you have a choice, reform or ruin. Which will it be?" The silence stretched unbearably. Eliza held her breath, aware that everything, all their work, all their risk, the future of hundreds of workers, balanced on this single moment. Then Adrian stood. "I vote for reform," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "Immediate implementation of all proposed measures. Fair wages, safety equipment, worker representation, all of it." Pemberton turned on him furiously. "Adrian, sit down. You don't have the authority." "I have a 20% stake," Adrian shot back. "That gives me authority, and I'm voting for reform." One of the other investors, a thin man named Harrison, slowly raised his hand. I agree. This has gone too far. If these documents are real, if we're actually facing prosecution—" "Don't be a coward," Blackwood spat. "I'm being practical," Harrison replied. "Reform will cut our profits, yes, but prosecution will cost us everything, our reputations, our freedom, our entire fortunes. I vote for reform." Another investor joined them. Then another. Within minutes, 5 of the 7 had voted for immediate implementation of reforms, leaving only Pemberton and Blackwood in opposition. Pemberton's face had gone from red to white with fury. "This is surrender. You're letting a handful of malcontents dictate terms to—" "We're accepting reality," Adrian said quietly. "Marcus was right. The system we built was rotten. It's time to rebuild it properly." Fitzpatrick stood from his seat among the journalists. "For the record, gentlemen, can I confirm that the Cork Industrial Consortium has just agreed to implement comprehensive labor reforms, including fair wages, safety equipment, worker representation, and reinstatement of recently terminated employees?" "Yes," Adrian said before Pemberton could object. "That is our official position." The room erupted. Journalists surged forward with questions. The workers by the wall embraced each other, tears streaming down faces. City officials congratulated themselves for attending such a momentous announcement. And Eliza found Marcus's eyes across the chaos, saw the disbelief and triumph warring on his face, and felt something break open in her chest. A flood of relief and joy so intense it made her dizzy. They'd done it. Against all odds, against every expectation, they'd actually forced the investors to capitulate. Mary appeared at Eliza's side, her face wet with tears. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "We did it," Eliza corrected, pulling her friend into a fierce hug. "All of us together." As the celebration continued around them, Eliza watched Marcus being questioned by journalists, watched him handle their inquiries with calm authority, watched him glance repeatedly in her direction as if to confirm she was really there, that this was really happening. And she realized that somewhere along the way, in the midst of all the danger and fear and impossible odds, she'd fallen completely in love with the cold, pragmatic lord who'd learned to hope. The celebration in the Imperial Hotel ballroom continued for another hour, but Eliza barely registered it. She stood to the side, watching Marcus field questions from journalists and city officials, watching the investors who'd voted for reform shake hands with labor organizers, watching history remake itself in real time. Adrian appeared beside her, his face drawn and older than she remembered. "Eliza," he said quietly, "may I speak with you, privately?" She hesitated, then nodded. They moved to a quiet corner away from the crowd, and Adrian seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Several, actually, for lying about my involvement with the mills, for dismissing your concerns, for choosing comfort over courage, as you so accurately put it." "Why did you vote for reform?" Eliza asked. "Was it guilt, fear of prosecution, or did you actually mean it?" Adrian met her eyes, and she saw genuine remorse there. "All of those things, but mostly because I finally saw what you and Marcus had been trying to show me, that the system I'd been defending was built on suffering I'd chosen to ignore. And I realized I could either be the kind of man who perpetuated that suffering or the kind who tried to fix it." "What will the other investors do?" Eliza asked. Pemberton looked ready to murder someone. "Pemberton and Blackwood will fight this every step of the way," Adrian admitted. "They'll delay implementation, search for loopholes, try to minimize the reforms. which is why I'm proposing something that will make them even angrier. He paused, then continued. I'm selling my stake in the consortium, all 20%, and I'm using the proceeds to establish a workers' fund, medical care, education for their children, housing assistance, everything the mills should have been providing all along. Eliza stared at him, shocked. Adrian, that's your entire fortune. Your commission, your lifestyle, everything depends on those dividends. I know. Adrian smiled sadly. Turns out I can't buy my way into feeling like a decent human being, so I'm trying something different. It won't undo the harm I've caused, but maybe it will help prevent future harm. Before Eliza could respond, Marcus appeared, his expression wary as he looked between them. Am I interrupting? No, Adrian said. I was just telling Eliza about my decision to divest from the consortium. I wanted you to know as well, brother. What you did today, exposing the truth despite the cost to our family name, that took more courage than anything I've ever done. I'm proud of you, and ashamed it took me so long to see what you saw. Something shifted in Marcus's face, surprise giving way to cautious hope. You mean that? I do. Adrian extended his hand. I know I can't undo my complicity, but I'd like to try to make amends if you'll let me. Ooh. Marcus clasped his brother's hand, and Eliza saw years of complicated family history pass between them in that single gesture. We'll talk, Marcus said, after we get through the immediate aftermath of this, but yes, Adrian, I'd like that. Adrian nodded, squeezed Marcus's shoulder once, then walked away, leaving them alone in their corner. He's really selling his stake? Marcus asked quietly. Apparently. Eliza watched Adrian disappear into the crowd. People can change, even when you least expect it. Like cold, pragmatic lords learning to fight for justice? Marcus's mouth quirked into a small smile. Exactly like that. Eliza took his hand. What happens now? The investors agreed to reforms, but getting them actually implemented will be a battle, Marcus finished grimly. Pemberton will resist every step, but we have public support now, and more importantly, we have the workers organized. As long as they stay united, keep pressure on the consortium, the reforms will stick. And us? Eliza asked, her heart suddenly hammering. What happens with us? Marcus pulled her closer, away from prying eyes, into an alcove near the windows. Outside, Cork stretched vast and industrial, its smokestack still pumping pollution into the gray sky. But something had shifted in the city's foundation, invisible but unmistakable. I'm in love with you, Marcus said simply. I think I have been since you called me a coward in the middle of a waltz, and I know the class difference makes it complicated. I know my family will be scandalized. I know society will... Eliza kissed him, cutting off his worried cataloging of obstacles. When they broke apart, she was smiling. I don't care about society's opinion, she said. I care about you. About the man who risked everything to do the right thing. About the partner who stood beside me when it would have been easier to walk away. I love you too, Marcus. So we'll figure out the rest. The relief on his face was beautiful to see. He kissed her again, slower this time, and Eliza felt the last of her walls crumble. She'd spent so long fighting alone, protecting her students, carrying the weight of their suffering by herself, having someone to share that burden with, someone who understood and cared just as fiercely, felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, Fitzpatrick was approaching with his notebook, a shrewd gleam in his eyes. Lord Vale, Miss Harrow, I have a few follow-up questions for tomorrow's article. They spent the next hour being interviewed, telling the full story of their investigation, the destroyed evidence, the midnight break-in, the final confrontation. Fitzpatrick scribbled furiously, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions, his expression growing more animated as the narrative unfolded. This is extraordinary, he said when they finished. A lord and a dance instructor taking on the industrial elite. The public will eat this up. But I have to ask, Miss Harrow, what made you trust Lord Vale initially, given your background and his family's involvement with the mills? Eliza thought back to that morning when Marcus had appeared at her door, when she'd been so suspicious of his motives. I didn't trust him, she admitted. Not at first, but I trusted his anger. When someone looks at suffering and feels genuine rage rather than dismissal, that tells you something about their character. And Marcus's rage at what we found in those mills, that was real. Everything else followed from that. Fitzpatrick nodded approvingly. One more question. What's next for both of you? The reforms are agreed to in principle, but implementation will take months, possibly years. How do you ensure they actually happen? Marcus and Eliza exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed this explicitly, but the answer seemed obvious. We stay involved, Marcus said. Monitor the consortium's compliance. Work with the reinstated workers to ensure their representation is meaningful, not just performative. And if necessary, we expose any backsliding just as publicly as we expose the original fraud. And expand beyond Cork, Eliza added, surprising herself with the ambition of the idea even as she spoke it. These conditions aren't unique to our city. Mills across Ireland operate the same way. Workers everywhere deserve the dignity and safety we're fighting for here. So once we've secured lasting reform in Cork, we take what we've learned and help workers elsewhere demand the same. Fitzpatrick's eyes gleamed. A labor reform movement led by an aristocrat and a working-class woman. The symbolism alone is powerful. I'll make sure to emphasize that in the article. As evening fell and the crowd finally began to disperse, Mary approached them one last time. Her breathing had worsened throughout the afternoon, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were bright. Miss Eliza, Lord Vale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for everything. You gave us our humanity back. You never lost it, Eliza replied, gripping Mary's rough hands. You just finally have people in power willing to acknowledge it. Mary smiled. I won't live to see all the changes. My lungs are too far gone. But knowing my daughter will grow up in a better world, that the mills will be safer, that workers will have voices, that's enough. That's everything. She embraced Eliza, then Marcus, and walked away with Thomas supporting her arm. Watching them go, Eliza felt tears finally spill over. She's right, you know, Marcus said quietly. Mary won't see the full transformation. Neither will many of the workers who suffered worst under the old system. That's the tragedy of injustice. By the time you fix it, you've already lost people to it. Then we make sure their suffering wasn't meaningless, Eliza replied, wiping her eyes. We make sure the changes stick, that their sacrifice bought something real and lasting. Marcus nodded, pulling her close. They stood together in the emptying ballroom, holding each other while Cork's industrial machinery churned on outside, already beginning its slow transformation. The weeks that followed were chaos in the best possible way. Fitzpatrick's article ran on the front page of the Cork Examiner, then was picked up by papers in Dublin, London, and beyond. The story of a lord and a dance instructor exposing industrial exploitation captured public imagination in ways that dry policy discussions never could. The consortium, forced by public pressure and legal threats, began implementing reforms. Slowly at first, with Pemberton fighting every measure, but implementation nonetheless. New safety guards appeared on the looms. Wages increased to match the amounts reported in tax filings. A workers' committee was established with actual authority to raise concerns and demand changes. Children disappeared from the factory floors, sent to newly established schools, funded partially by Adrian's divested fortune. The 8-year-old girl, Eliza and Marcus, had seen crawling under running looms, was now learning to read instead. Mary Sullivan died 6 weeks after the confrontation at the Imperial Hotel. But she died in a real bed, in housing paid for by the Workers' Fund, surrounded by friends who sang and told stories late into the night. And her daughter didn't have to work the mills to survive. That small mercy felt like victory. The warehouse on Dock Street was rebuilt and expanded with donations from supporters. It became more than just a dance hall. It became a community center where workers gathered to organize, to learn, to remind themselves they were human. Eliza taught dance there twice a week, but now her students came with straight backs and hope in their eyes rather than exhausted desperation. Marcus threw himself into the work of ensuring compliance, making unannounced inspections of the mills, documenting every attempt at backsliding, and publicly shaming any investor who tried to circumvent the reforms. Pemberton eventually sold his stake and left Cork entirely, unable to stomach operating under the new regulations. Blackwood followed shortly after. And through it all, Eliza and Marcus built something that scandalized society and thrilled the workers they'd fought for. A genuine partnership that ignored class boundaries and conventional expectations. They worked together, lived together in the small house on Merchant Street that shocked Marcus's aristocratic friends, and loved each other with the fierce intensity of people who'd risked everything and won. 8 months after the Imperial Hotel confrontation, they stood together in a packed church in the workers' district. Not the grand cathedral where aristocratic weddings took place, but a simple stone building where Mary Sullivan's funeral had been held, where generations of workers had marked life's passages. Adrian stood as Marcus's best man, his own transformation still ongoing but real. Catherine Doyle served as Eliza's maid of honor, her hands rough from years at the looms but her face glowing with genuine joy. The guests were a chaotic mix of classes, lords and ladies sitting uncomfortably beside mill workers, journalists and labor organizers, city officials and reformed investors. The ceremony was brief and unconventional. No elaborate vows or religious pageantry, just honest promises made in front of witnesses who understood what those promises cost. "I promise," Marcus said, his voice carrying to the back rows, "to never stop seeing, to never stop caring, to fight beside you until every worker in every mill knows the dignity you helped me understand." "I promise," Eliza replied, her hand steady in his, "to keep believing change is possible even when it seems impossible. To keep pushing, keep demanding, keep hoping, together." They sealed it with a kiss that made the aristocratic guests murmur disapprovingly and the workers cheer with abandoned joy. Afterward, the celebration moved to the rebuilt warehouse where Eliza had first taught Mary to waltz. Tables groaned under food contributed by dozens of families. A proper orchestra played, musicians from the theater district who'd volunteered their time. And when the dancing began, it wasn't stratified by class or status. Lords waltzed with mill workers, ladies partnered with foremen. Thomas Brennan, missing 2 fingers but grinning widely, led a blushing magistrate through a somewhat clumsy but enthusiastic polka. Marcus swept Eliza onto the floor for the first dance, and she remembered that night at Ashford Manor when he'd commandeered her from Adrian, when they'd argued about hope and dignity while a grieving man's accusations rang in the background. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked, reading her expression. "About how far we've come. How much has changed." Eliza looked around the warehouse, at the celebration that would have been impossible a year ago. "About Bridget Murphy and Mary Sullivan and all the others we couldn't save." "But we saved hundreds more," Marcus reminded her gently, "and created a model for reform that workers across Ireland are already demanding. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Eliza agreed, "but it's not finished. There's still so much work to do." Marcus smiled, not his cold, controlled smile from their first meeting, but something warm and genuine and full of love. "Good thing we have the rest of our lives to do it." They danced through the evening, sometimes together, sometimes with other partners, always circling back to each other. Eliza danced with Adrian, who admitted he was considering running for political office on a labor reform platform. She danced with Fitzpatrick, who was writing a book about their investigation and its aftermath. She danced with workers whose names she knew by heart, whose stories had shaped her understanding of injustice and resistance. And always, her eyes found Marcus across the crowded floor. Marcus arguing passionately with a city official about expanding reforms to other industries. Marcus laughing with Thomas over some shared joke. Marcus watching her with an expression that still made her heart skip despite months of partnership and love. As midnight approached and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Eliza slipped outside for air. The November night was cold but clear, stars visible despite Cork's industrial haze. She stood in the alley where she'd first shown Marcus the squalid conditions of workers' housing, where he'd sworn to burn down the system if necessary. He found her there moments later, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Escaping your own wedding celebration?" he teased. "Just taking a moment to appreciate what we built." Eliza leaned against him, both of them looking out over the industrial district. "A year ago, I was teaching dance in a broken-down warehouse, trying to give workers a few hours of dignity while they slowly died. Now look at us." "Now look at them," Marcus corrected, nodding toward the warehouse where music and laughter spilled into the night. "We helped, but they did the actual changing. They testified. They organized. They refused to accept exploitation as inevitable. We just gave them a platform and some strategic support." "You're being modest." "I'm being accurate." Marcus turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. The real victory isn't what we did, Eliza. It's what they learned they could do. That's what will outlast us. Not the specific reforms we forced, but the example we set. Workers realizing they have power when they organize. Aristocrats realizing their comfort comes at a cost. The whole rotten system being forced to acknowledge that dignity isn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Eliza kissed him, tasting wine and hope and the future they were building together. "I love you," she said when they broke apart. "My cold, pragmatic lord who learned to believe in impossible things." "I love you too," Marcus replied. "My fierce dance instructor who taught me that hope isn't dangerous. Hopelessness is." They stood together in the alley while Cork's mills churned around them, their smokestacks still pumping smoke but now under regulations that protected the people inside. Still imperfect, still industrial, but fundamentally changed by what two unlikely partners had dared to expose. Inside the warehouse, someone called for another waltz. The orchestra struck up a familiar melody, the same one that had been playing during Eliza and Marcus's first dance at Ashford Manor, when everything had been glittering surfaces hiding brutal truths. "Shall we?" Marcus offered his arm. "Always," Eliza replied. They walked back inside together, into warmth and music and a celebration that represented everything they'd fought for. The dance floor was packed with people who shouldn't be dancing together according to society's rules, workers and lords, women and men of different classes, all of them moving to the same rhythm, sharing the same space, living proof that the rigid hierarchies enforcing Cork's industrial order could be challenged and changed. Marcus pulled Eliza into the waltz, and this time there was no argument, no clash of philosophies, no tension beyond the delicious awareness of his hands on her waist, her palm pressed to his shoulder. Just partnership and love, and the bone-deep satisfaction of work well done, and more work yet to come. As they turned across the floor, Eliza caught glimpses of the future in the faces around them. Catherine Doyle laughing with genuine joy for the first time in years. Thomas Brennan's children playing in a corner, well-fed and safe. Adrian deep in conversation with labor organizers. His transformation from complicit investor to reform advocate nearly complete. And everywhere, workers standing straighter, speaking louder, believing in their own worth because someone had finally proven it was possible to challenge the powerful and win. The song ended, but the celebration continued, spilling into the small hours of morning. When Eliza and Marcus finally left, exhausted but happy, they walked through streets that looked the same as they had a year ago, but felt fundamentally different. The same brick buildings, the same industrial smoke, but now with regulations protecting the people inside those buildings, with hope replacing despair. They reached the small house on Merchant Street as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Inside, everything was modest and comfortable, a far cry from the Vale family estates Marcus had access to, but infinitely more theirs. "No regrets?" Eliza asked as they stood in the doorway, looking back toward the industrial district where their work had begun. Marcus considered the question seriously. "My family's fortune is diminished. My social standing is ruined. I'll spend the rest of my life fighting battles most aristocrats find distasteful or beneath them, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not even the part where you got punched at the Imperial Hotel? Especially not that part," Marcus grinned. "That's when I knew we'd actually rattled them enough to make change possible." They went inside, closing the door on Cork's industrial sprawl. But it wasn't an ending, just a pause before the next day's work, the next fight, the next opportunity to prove that systems built on exploitation could be torn down and rebuilt with dignity at their foundation. Because that's what Eliza and Marcus had learned through weeks of investigation and confrontation and risk. Change wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small decisions to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile. It was workers finding courage to testify despite retaliation. It was an aristocrat choosing justice over comfort. It was a dance instructor refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable. And it was two people from utterly different worlds discovering that love and partnership could bridge any divide, as long as both were willing to fight for something bigger than themselves. Outside, Cork's mills began their morning shift, safer now, fairer now, but still requiring constant vigilance to ensure the reforms held. Eliza and Marcus would provide that vigilance, together with the workers who'd learned their own power, the journalists who'd learned to look past sanitized reports, the politicians who'd learned that labor reform could be popular policy. The revolution they'd started in a glittering ballroom with the stolen dance had only just begun. But as Eliza fell asleep in Marcus's arms, the first real rest she'd had in months, she knew with bone-deep certainty that it would continue. Because hope, it turned out, wasn't dangerous at all. Hopelessness was dangerous. Accepting injustice as inevitable was dangerous. Valuing profit over human life was dangerous. But hope, real hope backed by courage and partnership and the refusal to look away from suffering, that was the most powerful force in the world. And in a small house on Merchant Street, in a city slowly transforming itself, two people who'd learned that truth held each other close and dreamed of all the impossible things they'd make possible together. The end of one chapter, the beginning of everything else.